if you ever grew up in the 1940s, I mean 60s, I mean 90s, 2000s. Anyways, you might have remembered a brand known as Chef Boyardee. You know, that brand that gets like ravioli or spaghetti or something like that and shoves it into a can for a cheap price that we all grew up eating as a snack or as a dinner? Yeah, it seems like for whatever reason it's in almost all of our childhoods and it's been around for almost 100 years. And with its 100th anniversary being in a couple years, I decided to make the Chef Boyardee iceberg. And yes, I know it's been a long time since I covered an iceberg. So then I decided to make an iceberg about Chef Boyardee, about most but half of the stuff that everyone knows about it. I don't know, doing research about this brand is like doing research for shoes. It's difficult. Anyway, if you don't know what an iceberg is basically a chart of a bunch of facts and conspiracies about it, from the higher layers ranging from common stuff to the lower layers ranging from the more obscure and sometimes dark stuff. Also, at the same time, I am going to be using the usual iceberg ranking system that every other YouTuber uses. If I have a high amount of Chef Boyardee cans on screen, that means I know what I'm talking about. If I have a low amount of them, that means I hardly know what I'm talking about. If I have only one, I honestly don't know. Without all the way, let's start the iceberg. Hector Boyardee. Hector Boyardee was born in Plazienza, Italy in 1897, which a couple years later, he would go to America and work for the Plaza Hotel, which then he eventually would become the head chef of there. And then a few years later, he would move to Ohio and start his own restaurant there. While at the same time, many customers were interested in Italian food, which then he ended up giving them a few ingredients on how to like make spaghetti, which eventually gave him the bright idea to start a company of just how to make Italian food, and that would be Chef Boyardee as we know it now today. There's several other stuff about this company and several other things about it that I will mention later on in the iceberg, such as the spaghetti. Chef Boyardee beef ravioli. Chef Boyardee beef raviolis were one of the many items that did exist back then. And also, this is the most common item that any person who ate Chef Boyardee will remember. Chef Boyardee Paw Patrol. One of the many cans of Chef Boyardee, or things of Chef Boyardee have you seen recently, is most likely the Chef Boyardee Paw Patrols edition. And there were many other shape variants of it, and we'll talk about one of the most famous ones later in the iceberg. Chef Boyardee Cheeseburger Macaroni. This is one of the many Chef Boyardee flavors that are extremely bizarre. This is basically one of the modern ones. Basically, it's like the pasta is in like a cheesy meat sauce, kind of similar to a hamburger, but at the same time hamburgers have their own ingredients. But at least this thing beats Pringles hamburger Pringles. Rolling can commercial. This is the most nostalgic commercial for anyone who has ever eaten Chef Boyardee. Anyway, the plot of the commercial is a child wanting to get a can of Chef Boyardee, but after they put it back, the can falls on the ground and starts rolling all the way to their house, and this became a really big meme, due to it being how memorable it is, and just because it's a can of Chef Boyardee that rolls around. HBO's The Last of Us 20-year-old can of Chef Boyardee. The Last of Us is considered to be one of the best PlayStation games of the decade so far. Around 2023, HBO ended up making a live-action series of the video game starring Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey. In episode 4 of the show, there's a scene where they're seen be eating a can of Chef Boyardee that's over 20 years old, and we'll talk about if the effects of eating an old can of Chef Boyardee will do anything. And also in episode 9, they find a can of Chef Boyardee beefaroni. I thought I just mentioned that. Chef Boyardee pizza kits. Want to know how to make a pizza? The homemade style? Chef Boyardee pizza kits are basically that. Basically, it's a kit on how to make pizza. Nowadays, they're kind of a little bit more different, but back then that's how they were. Pac-Man Chef Boyardee edition. I told you we'll be talking about other shaped Chef Boyardee products. This is one of the more popular and memorable ones of the 1980s and 90s. Basically, there was these Chef Boyardee like type of noodles that were all Pac-Man shaped, which was really cool. And you know, these things are discontinued, but they are worth a certain amount on eBay. Mentioned in Ratatouille. In Ratatouille, Anton Ego, in a scene in a movie, mentions Chef Boyardee.
Right alongside another equally famous chef, Monsieur Boyardee.
Touché.
Does this mean that in their universe, Chef Boyardee does exist somehow in their universe, and that he probably tried one of his dishes, whether it being from a can or whether it's being from a restaurant. This makes me interested now of knowing this. Chef Boyardee cauliflower noodles. This is part of one of the many trends that many companies that make noodles would do, where they would make them out of cauliflowers for more of a healthier thing. Chef Boyardee did jump on this train by making several different variants. Chef Boyardee rice, chicken, and vegetables. This is one of the other variants of Chef Boyardee, having rice, chicken, and vegetables, but this actually was recalled a couple of years ago because milk and wheat were not listed as ingredients. And there's also a huge rabbit hole about Chef Boyardee controversy, but we won't get into that later on until this iceberg. Anna Boyardee. Anna Boyardee is the great-grandniece of Hector Boyardee. She also cooks and made several other dishes. And also, she's famous for writing a book called Delicious Memories, Recipes, and Stories from Chef Boyardee Family. Chef Boyardee Good to Go Snack Kit. This is one of the many snack kits that store sells. One of them is actually with Chef Boyardee products, and also a snack pack and an oatmeal thing. Chef Boyardee lawsuit. A couple years ago, there was a lawsuit with Chef Boyardee, mainly because they labeled on the can no preservatives, but it contained a certain thing known as citric acid, and this lawsuit led to $5 million in damage. Chef Boyardee knockoffs. It's just simple as it sounds, knockoffs of Chef Boyardee, which now makes me question if they are better than Chef Boyardee. Chef Boyardee WWF Pro Wrestling ads. These are of the many Chef Boyardee WWF Pro Wrestling ads they had at the time. It's kind of interesting to see how many stuff Chef Boyardee has sponsored before. Boyardee spelled his name boyardee for his name pronunciation. Back then, when he started his company, Hector Boyardee spelled his name as boyardee in order for people to pronounce his name correctly. Chef Boyardee cans rationed the World War II troops. During the time of World War II, the military asked the Chef Boyardee family to start canning their food so they could use it as military rations, which they made a lot of them for a lot of military soldiers. Chef Boyardee spaghetti was originally different. So you know how there's those cans of Chef Boyardee spaghetti, right, that are already made? Back then the concept was a lot more different, and this has to do with the whole thing that started before Chef Boyardee, where many customers were interested in Italian food, so he basically sent them home with pasta, sauce, and cheese in order to help teach them how to make it, so they can make it at home. But then later on when he made Chef Boyardee, he actually would reuse that concept where he would make boxes with the noodles, the pasta sauce, and the cheese, so you'd be able to make a homemade spaghetti. But then it seems like many years later they just did all that for you with the new Chef Boyardee spaghetti cans. It sounded like a fun experience. Hank Harris and Chef Boyardee commercials. Many 90s kids will remember him as the beefy boy in the Chef Boyardee commercial who always says, beefy, at the end of the commercial, while trying to get his hands on a can of Chef Boyardee ravioli or beefaroni, which he actually became a really successful actor and appeared in other stuff like Hellbent and Bones. Chef Boyardee pepperoni pizza rulli. Remember when we talked about really strange flavors? This is one of them in the 90s. Basically, it was the beef ravioli, but they basically put pepperoni on it. And this makes me question it so much. Was the 90s a little bit strange? Chef Boyardee chicken ravioli. This is another variant of, the Chef Boyardee ravioli. And it seems like some of these do exist nowadays, but I honestly forgot that ravioli doesn't have to have beef, but it could also have other ingredients in there, like chicken. Chef Boyardee Twisty Rolly Chili Cheese Dog. This is another strange Chef Boyardee flavor from the 90s and 2000s. And it sounds like what it is. A twisty noodle with chili cheese. Chef Boyardee Pamtree video. Pamtree is a YouTube channel that makes really strange animations that somehow connect to each other. Anyway, there's one video called Chef Boyardee, where it tells the tale of a man who doesn't really like Chef Boyardee until one day a giant can of Chef Boyardee appears as he's told to go inside the can. And then eventually he spends his entire life dedicated to just eating Chef Boyardee. That's basically the whole video. The Rock in a Chef Boyardee commercial. I thought I'd throw this in the bottom layer because, you know, it's The Rock. You know, The Rock, he appeared in a Chef Boyardee commercial. A Chef Boyardee commercial. And it had The Rock. Old Chef Boyardee cans are edible. So has to do with the whole talk about if old cans of food are actually edible. So, according to several websites and several interviews of people who actually do store old canned foods and eat them, it's more of a yes and no as the answer. Yes, it's edible to eat a can that's almost half a decade old or almost 2 decades old, but at the same time there's a few side effects about it. And no, it's not edible due to how the condition of the can might be. But it's more of a yes and no, like if the can isn't damaged, it is edible, but if it's like damaged, then it's not edible. It all depends on the can. What happened to the Tin Man? In an ad for Chef Boyardee, the Tin Man from Wizard of Oz appears, running away from children because he has a Chef Boyardee logo slapped on his back for some reason. The reason why I mention this is because at the end of the commercial, he gets stuck inside of a cafeteria full of children and they say lock the door as the commercial ends. So my question is, what happened to him? Does he make it out? Did the children not have a heart and just destroyed him because they thought he was Chef Boyardee ravioli? Maybe one day we'll find out. Chef Boyardee statue. This is referring to 2 Chef Boyardee statue related things. One of them being that in Omaha, Nebraska, there's actually a Chef Boyardee statue in honor of him, and also because of canned foods, as he was one of the people who started off with the canned food business. Every can of Chef Boyardee is personalized. Now you might be thinking, what do you mean they're personalized? They're just a can of food. But let me tell you, I'm assuming the commercial is probably showing how Chef Boyardee cans act. Whenever a human isn't around looking at them, they start moving around. For some reason, they read the customer's mind, which is by following them home. Why do you think in that Chef Boyardee commercial, when that child really wanted Chef Boyardee, the can just followed her home? The can knows everything about her, because the can is personalized. Oh, I'm just joking. Chef Boyardee cans aren't personalized. Or I don't think they're personalized. Alright, you know what, just to end it good, I'm just gonna add an extra thing to the iceberg. Chef Boyardee spider. This is referring to a time when a lady ended up reporting that there was bits of spider inside of her Chef Boyardee. It's unknown how it got in there, but at the same time, it does give me deja vu to the Oreo spider. But the thing about it is that this was somewhat legit, which terrifies me.
Hasta la vista, baby!